The neon glow of the Shell sign buzzed faintly in the cool Texas night, its flickering light throwing long shadows across the cracked pavement. Route 65 was usually quiet at this hour, but the gas station was crowded, every pump occupied, every lane filled with tired travelers and impatient locals. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a sleek black Mercedes idled, its polished body catching the harsh fluorescent glare of the overhead lamps. It was the kind of car that didn't belong here. Too clean, too expensive, too polished against the dust and grit of a roadside stop. Inside stood a man who looked ordinary enough in his worn jeans and simple gray shirt. Nothing about him screamed wealth, not at first glance. But then your eyes would catch the heavy timepiece on his wrist, the watch that alone was worth more than most people's homes. His name was Alexander Mitchell. At 42, he had once controlled an empire worth billions. Tonight, however, he was just another customer at pump number 7, swiping his card and waiting for the machine to beep. It beeped, but not the way it should have. Transaction declined, the screen flashed in cold, unapologetic letters. The attendant inside the booth sighed, her voice crackling through the speaker. "Sir, please try again." Her tone was clipped, the sound of someone who had watched the same little drama play out too many times. Alexander tried again. He slid the card carefully, almost reverently, as if his steady hand could will it into working. Declined. He swallowed, felt his chest tighten, then pulled out another card. Declined again. The third card was no different. A hollow beep, a flash of words across the screen, and a ripple of murmurs broke out among the people waiting behind him. "Seriously?" a man muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Guy's driving a Mercedes and can't pay $23 for gas." A middle-aged woman with a smoker's laugh chuckled, shaking her head. "Probably one of those fake influencers. Pretend to be rich, but it's all smoke and mirrors." Alexander's jaw clenched. The sting of their words felt sharper than it should have, like salt rubbed into an open wound. He didn't look back at them. He couldn't. The line of cars stretched farther, horns tapping impatiently now, people leaning out of windows to see what was causing the holdup. Every second felt heavier, pressing against him, suffocating him in humiliation. The attendant's voice returned, this time carrying a note of irritation. "Sir, if you can't complete the transaction, I'll have to ask you to move your vehicle." That single sentence was worse than the laughter. A billionaire, at least he used to be, being asked to step aside like a broke man holding up the line. The absurdity of it all might have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. He had walked through the halls of Congress, shaken hands with world leaders, sat at tables where nations made deals worth more than some countries' GDP. Yet here he was, a man who couldn't buy gas in the middle of nowhere. Alexander stood frozen, staring at the cold words on the pump's screen. Declined, declined, declined. His mind raced, not because he didn't know why this was happening, he knew all too well, but because the moment was so painfully symbolic. In the eyes of these strangers, he was no longer Alexander Mitchell, visionary billionaire. He was just another man caught in a lie, another fraud exposed in the harsh light of reality. Behind him, laughter swelled again, sharper this time, and he heard the unmistakable click of someone's phone camera. A photo, a video, evidence of his fall was already being captured. The whispers turned to chuckles, and the chuckles grew into bold, open comments. "Pathetic," someone spat. "Guess money can't buy everything," another said. Alexander let out a slow breath, the kind you release when you're on the edge of something. Rage, despair, or maybe just acceptance. He had faced boardrooms full of sharks and competitors who would do anything to see him fail. But this stung more deeply, because these weren't rivals, weren't enemies. These were ordinary people, and their judgment was merciless. In that moment, standing beneath the buzzing lights of a gas station off Route 65, Alexander Mitchell felt smaller than he had in his entire life. What none of them knew, what none of them could even imagine, was that his cards weren't declined because of lack of money. They had been blocked deliberately. Someone, somewhere, had pulled strings to make this happen. And behind their laughter, behind his humiliation, lay a truth so dangerous it could shake the entire world. But for now, all anyone saw was a man who couldn't pay for gas, and the night had only just begun. The night air carried a chill that seemed sharper now, as though even the Texas wind wanted to remind Alexander of his fall. He stood by the Mercedes, the pump handle dangling uselessly in his grip, while the crowd behind him shifted restlessly. The sound of car doors opening, impatient footsteps on pavement, and muffled laughter blended into a cruel symphony. His throat tightened. He had spoken on global stages where silence was demanded for every word he uttered, yet here he couldn't even command the respect of strangers waiting in line for gas. A man in a baseball cap leaned against his rusty pickup, smirking as he lit a cigarette. Big shot can't pay 23 bucks. That's a new one. His voice carried over the lot, drawing fresh laughter from a group of teenagers in a minivan. Their phones were already out, screens glowing, lenses trained on Alexander like weapons ready to capture his shame. The attendant inside the booth pressed the microphone again, her irritation now undisguised. "Sir, please, step aside. You're holding up the line." Alexander lowered the nozzle back onto its hook, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't turn to the crowd, didn't offer excuses. To explain himself now would sound pitiful, and he knew it. Instead, he reached for another card, one last attempt. The machine's screen blinked, processing, teasing him with the pause. Then came the inevitable. Declined. The laughter was louder this time, emboldened. Someone clapped sarcastically. A woman's voice rang out. "Guess the Mercedes is rented." The sting of her words cut deeper because the strangers weren't wrong in their assumption. From where they stood, he was a man who didn't belong in the world he appeared to inhabit. Alexander's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering toward the crowd. For a second, they caught sight of the watch on his wrist, the one piece of his old life he hadn't yet abandoned. The glint of the expensive timepiece in the fluorescent light seemed to ignite them further. "Look at that thing. He can't pay for gas, but he's got a watch worth more than my truck." A heavy silence fell over Alexander's chest, not around him, but within him. It was the suffocating quiet of shame, the kind that presses down until you can hardly breathe. For years, he had walked into rooms where his name turned heads, where people scrambled to shake his hand, desperate for his approval. But here, on this dusty strip of Route 65, he was nothing more than a spectacle. A man stripped of power, dignity, and control. A horn blared, sharp and long, shattering the air. "Move it already," someone shouted. The gas station lights hummed above, buzzing like they too mocked his paralysis. He considered leaving, just sliding back into the Mercedes, pulling away, pretending the moment had never happened. But he knew better. Even if he escaped their eyes tonight, the humiliation would follow him. He had seen the cameras, the raised phones. By morning, his face would be plastered online, dissected, mocked, turned into memes. The billionaire who couldn't pay for gas. For the first time in years, Alexander felt utterly alone. The crowd saw a man who had lost everything. What they couldn't see was the storm raging inside him, the knowledge of why this was happening, the deliberate cruelty behind his declined cards. And yet none of that mattered to them. Because in this moment, to the world, he wasn't Alexander Mitchell, the man who once controlled billions. He was just a man who couldn't buy $23 of gasoline. And then, just as the weight of shame threatened to crush him entirely, he heard it. A small, steady voice that cut through the laughter like a blade through cloth. "We can pay for him." It wasn't loud, but it was clear, and in the silence that followed, it felt like thunder. Two small figures stepped forward from the car behind him. Twin girls no more than 8, their braids swinging in the night air, their small hands clutching a pink purse. The sound of coins jingled faintly as they approached. The gas station went silent, phones lowered. The laughter died. Every pair of eyes turned toward the children who had dared to do what no adult had. Step forward with kindness in the face of cruelty. Alexander turned slowly, and when his gaze fell on them, something inside him shifted. These weren't just children. They were the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. And the night that had begun in humiliation was about to take a turn no one in that station could have predicted. The crowd at the gas station held its breath as if the Texas night itself had frozen in place. The girls stood there in the glow of the fluorescent lights, their small frames casting long, brave shadows on the cracked pavement. They couldn't have been taller than 4.5 feet, dressed in faded t-shirts and denim shorts. Their braids shimmered faintly under the buzzing lights, tipped with colorful beads that clicked softly as they moved. The pink purse between them looked like a toy compared to the sleek Mercedes behind Alexander, but the determination on their faces was something far beyond their years. "We can pay for him," they repeated, their voices steady in unison, as if rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror. But there was nothing rehearsed about this moment. It was raw, unfiltered, filled with the kind of innocence adults had long forgotten. Someone in the line gasped. Another muttered, "What are those kids doing?" A woman whispered harshly, "Girls, stop embarrassing your family." But the twins didn't stop. Grace, the more outspoken of the two, took one step forward, pulling the purse open. The sound of coins jingling echoed in the stillness. "We have $15.60. It's not enough," she admitted, glancing at her sister. Hope, quieter, but with eyes fierce and unblinking, gave a small nod of encouragement. "But our grandma always said if someone needs help, and you can help, even a little, you help." Her words landed like a stone in a pond, rippling through the crowd. The laughter, The mocking, the judgment, it all evaporated. Adults who moments earlier had been quick to sneer now shifted uncomfortably in their shoes. Alexander knelt down, his knees touching the rough concrete, and for the first time that night, the weight in his chest cracked. He had endured the humiliation of strangers, the sting of viral cameras, the burn of whispered cruelty, but this pierced him differently. These were children, untouched by the greed and deceit he had spent decades drowning in. They weren't calculating. They weren't trying to humiliate him further. They were simply offering kindness. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice hoarse, softer than he meant. Grace lifted her chin, bold despite the crowd watching. "Grace." Hope spoke almost like a whisper, but her words carried anyway. "Hope." Alexander's lips parted, and the name seemed to hang in the air. Grace. Hope. Words he hadn't spoken in years, not like this, not with meaning. They were the very things he had lost in his pursuit of power, things that billions of dollars and boardroom victories had never truly given him. He blinked quickly, fighting the sting in his eyes. "Grace and hope," he murmured, almost to himself, as though the universe had chosen to place them here for a reason. Behind him, the crowd shuffled. A man who had mocked earlier cleared his throat, suddenly quiet. The attendant inside the booth looked away, ashamed. For the first time all night, Alexander wasn't the one being judged. It was everyone else. The adults who had mocked him, the strangers who had chosen ridicule over compassion. The twins' mother rushed from their car, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Girls, what are you doing? Come back here right now." Her voice cracked with the weight of a mother's fear, the fear of exposing her children's softness in a world that so often rewarded cruelty. But the girls didn't move. They stood tall, their little pink purse dangling between them like a declaration. Grace looked up at Alexander, her eyes bright, unwavering. "It's not about how much money you have. It's about helping." Alexander exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man releases when something deep inside him shifts forever. He realized then that what those children offered wasn't $15.60. It was a mirror, a reflection of what he had forgotten, a reminder of what really mattered. And while the people at the gas station thought they were watching a spectacle, none of them understood they were witnessing the beginning of something far greater, because in that quiet Texas night, two little girls had given Alexander Mitchell something no bank account, no corporation, no empire ever had: grace and hope. And from that moment forward, nothing would ever be the same. Alexander stayed kneeling on the rough concrete, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, mixing with the faint jingling of coins inside the pink purse. His gaze lingered on the girls, Grace, standing bold, eyes flashing with stubborn courage, and Hope, quieter but steady, her small fingers curled tightly around the purse strap. The crowd around them, which moments ago had been quick to jeer, now fell into an uneasy silence. It was as if every adult present suddenly saw themselves reflected in those children's eyes and didn't like what stared back. Alexander opened his mouth, but no words came at first. For years, he had commanded boardrooms, bent billion-dollar deals to his will with a single sentence. Yet now, confronted by two 8-year-olds offering him everything they had, he found his voice caught in his throat. He finally whispered, almost reverently, "Grace, hope." The names rolled from his lips like an invocation, like prayers he hadn't known he needed to say. He thought about what those words meant. Grace, the ability to forgive, to show mercy even when none was deserved. Hope, the belief that tomorrow could still be better than today, even when everything seemed lost. Two qualities money couldn't buy, power couldn't command, and pride couldn't fake. The mother's hurried footsteps broke the fragile stillness. Diane, the twins' mom, reached them, her face flushed with embarrassment, voice tight with panic. "Girls, enough! I am so sorry, sir. They don't understand." She reached for the purse, trying to tug it back, but Grace pulled it against her chest, defiant. Alexander raised a hand gently, stopping Diane without touching her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw not the humiliated man from a moment ago, but someone else, someone broken, someone searching. "Don't scold them," he said quietly. "They've done nothing wrong. In fact," his voice cracked slightly, and he swallowed hard, "they've reminded me of something I'd forgotten." A murmur ran through the crowd, soft this time, no longer cruel but confused. People shifted, phones lowered. They were witnessing something unexpected, something that didn't fit into the easy narrative of a rich man's downfall. Grace tilted her head. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked. Her voice was small but clear, so honest it sliced through him. Alexander felt the sting of tears press against his eyes, and he blinked rapidly. He hadn't cried in decades, not when his father died, not when he was betrayed by his closest allies, not even when his empire was ripped away from him. But here, in front of a gas pump and two little girls with a pink purse full of coins, his chest trembled with an ache he could no longer contain. He forced a small smile for their sake. "I will be," he said softly. But the moment couldn't stay private. It never could. A click sounded, then another. Phones were raised again, capturing the sight of a billionaire kneeling in front of two black girls offering him money. By the time Alexander climbed back to his feet, the image had already begun its journey into the digital bloodstream of the world. He didn't know it then, but within an hour, that photo would hit Twitter. By morning, it would be everywhere, plastered across timelines, reposted on Instagram, dissected in news headlines. A billionaire humbled at a gas station, saved by the kindness of children. The hashtags would multiply, the memes would explode, and the world would laugh without knowing the truth. But right there, in that fragile moment before the storm broke, none of that mattered. What mattered was the simple fact that two children had shown him mercy when adults had offered only scorn. As Alexander slid back into his car, hands trembling on the steering wheel, he whispered their names again like a vow. Grace. Hope. He didn't know yet how, but he knew this much. They had changed him. And as the Mercedes rolled out of the station, the crowd's chatter rising behind him, Alexander Mitchell realized something that made his stomach tighten with both fear and resolve. The world might see him as a fallen billionaire, but to those two girls, he was simply a man in need of help. And because of them, he now carried a responsibility far greater than his ruined reputation. What he didn't know, what no one could yet imagine, was that this single moment, captured by a stranger's camera, would soon ignite a storm powerful enough to shake the foundations of everything he once built. The night sky over Route 65 was silent, but Alexander's world was anything but. By the time his Mercedes rolled into the dim parking lot of a cheap roadside motel, the photograph of him kneeling before Grace and Hope had already taken on a life of its own. Someone at the gas station had posted it to Twitter with a sneering caption, "Bankrupt billionaire begs two little girls for gas money." The image spread like wildfire. By the time Alexander opened the motel room door, exhausted, his phone was buzzing uncontrollably. He tossed it onto the creaky bedspread, trying to ignore it, but the vibrations kept coming, hundreds of notifications stacking faster than he could process. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. His face filled the screen, kneeling in front of two girls holding their pink purse, eyes wet with emotion. The comments beneath the post were ruthless. "So much for the $3 billion genius. Can't even buy gas. That Mercedes must be rented. What a fraud. White billionaire rescued by black kids. You can't make this up. This is karma served ice cold." His stomach twisted. It wasn't just a bad headline. It was humiliation made into entertainment. Memes had already appeared, twisting the photo into cruel jokes. Someone had added cartoon speech bubbles, Grace saying, "We can pay for him," with Alexander replying, "I'll take the coins, please." Another turned it into a TikTok remix, the twins' voices set to a looping electronic beat. The kindness of two little girls was already being cheapened, distorted into something ugly. By morning, the story was everywhere. #billionaire beggar trended at number 1. News outlets ran with it. Once powerful CEO humbled by children at gas station. Some articles speculated he was broke. Others claimed he was mentally unstable, hiding from creditors. None of them were true, but truth mattered less than spectacle. At a diner across town, truckers laughed over their eggs and coffee, passing around the photo on cracked phone screens. In New York, glossy morning shows debated whether Alexander Mitchell had always been a fraud. In Silicon Valley, former colleagues whispered that the fall had been coming for years. The world had decided who he was now, and it wasn't the man who once sat atop a $3 billion empire. It was the man who couldn't pay $23 for gas. Alexander sat on the edge of the motel bed, hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had built entire companies on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to think 5 moves ahead. But this was different. This wasn't a mob. A market crash, a hostile takeover, or a competitor's betrayal. This was personal. His name, his dignity, his very identity was being shredded in front of millions. And what burned him most wasn't the ridicule aimed at him. It was that Grace and Hope, the two children whose kindness had pierced through his despair, were now caught in the storm. Their faces, innocent and unguarded, were plastered across every platform. They hadn't asked for this. He scrolled further, and his pulse quickened as he found one particular comment. It was short, almost casual, but he recognized the phone number it came from instantly. Disappearing didn't work, Alex. Maybe it's time you realize some secrets are too big for one man. J.K. Jonathan Kane. Alexander's chest tightened, memories flashing like lightning. Boardrooms filled with glass walls, Jonathan sitting across from him, smiling that perfect smile that had once seemed like friendship, but had always been something colder. Jonathan had been his partner, his confidant, his closest ally, and now Jonathan was the man orchestrating his ruin. Another message buzzed in, this one colder than the first. By the way, nice little friends you've made. Grace and Hope, isn't it? Shame if their family got caught in the crossfire of your stubbornness. Alexander dropped the phone onto the bed, his breath shallow. It wasn't just about him anymore. Jonathan wasn't content with stripping him of power. He was threatening innocent children. Children who had given him something no boardroom, no investor, no empire ever could. A reminder of what mattered. For the first time in weeks, Alexander felt something sharper than despair. It was anger, but not the selfish kind that once fueled his ambition. This was different. This was protective, primal, the kind of fire that ignited only when someone dared to threaten the innocent. He stood by the window, staring out at the motel's flickering neon sign. Somewhere out there, Grace and Hope were asleep, unaware that their kindness had set off a chain reaction. Hat was about to spiral into something far greater than a gas station humiliation. The world saw a bankrupt billionaire. Jonathan saw a man cornered and broken. But Alexander knew something neither of them realized yet. He was done running, done hiding. If Jonathan wanted a war, then Alexander would give him one. And this time, he wouldn't just be fighting for his own name. He'd be fighting for Grace, for hope, for the truth. And for the first time since everything was ripped away, he felt a dangerous kind of calm. Because a man with nothing left to lose, except the chance to protect what really mattered, was a man you should never underestimate. Morning light bled through the torn curtains of the motel room, casting a pale glow across the bed where Alexander hadn't slept a single hour. His phone, lying face up on the nightstand, buzzed again. Another headline, another meme, another dagger in his reputation. But it wasn't the ridicule that haunted him. It was the message from Jonathan, the veiled threat against Grace and Hope. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the twins' faces at the gas station. Grace's bold chin lifted, Hope's steady eyes locked on him, their pink purse dangling between them. They had no idea they were now targets in a game they never chose to play. Jonathan Kane, sitting hundreds of miles away in a high-rise tower in Manhattan, wasn't wasting time. On the 42nd floor of Technocore headquarters, the boardroom buzzed with activity. Jonathan, polished in his tailored Italian suit, leaned back in a leather chair with a glass of scotch in his hand. Around the table sat lawyers, PR specialists, and a handful of executives who owed him their loyalty, or feared what happened if they didn't. The campaign is working, said David Chun, the company's head of marketing, his voice brimming with smug pride. The narrative that Alexander's unstable is everywhere. Memes are driving traffic. Hashtag engagement is through the roof. Stock value has risen 3% in 48 hours. Jonathan smiled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Good. The more ridiculous he looks, the less credible he becomes. No one listens to a beggar, even if he once owned the building they're standing in. Across the table, Marcus Webb, Technocore's head of security and a former CIA operative, cleared his throat. His tone was colder, more calculating. We've identified 2 children connected to the incident. Grace and Hope Washington, 8 years old. Their mother, Diane, works as a nurse. They live in a modest neighborhood about 10 miles from the gas station. Jonathan arched an eyebrow, his lips twitching into something between a smirk and a sneer. And? Marcus leaned forward. We could apply indirect pressure, not violence, never anything that can be traced, but subtle intimidation. Bureaucratic delays, false bills, maybe a random inspection at the mother's workplace. Enough to make their lives uncomfortable. The goal is simple. Mitchell either intervenes, which we document and frame as manipulative, or he stays silent and loses his savior narrative. Silence filled the boardroom for a beat. Jonathan set his glass down, the sound sharp against the polished wood. His eyes glinted with that familiar mix of arrogance and cruelty Alexander knew all too well. Do it. Keep it clean. And make sure Alexander knows without ever being able to prove it. Nothing crushes a man faster than watching innocence suffer because of him. While Jonathan plodded in his tower, Alexander sat in the motel with his laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. The years hadn't stripped him of his genius. He still had access to systems he'd built, backdoors he'd coded when Technocore was still his. Every email Jonathan sent, every transfer, every CLOs in operation ordered was already being copied and redirected to servers Alexander controlled. Jonathan thought he was in control, but Alexander had planted his roots deep into the very soil of the empire they once built together. Still, none of that mattered if Grace and Hope were in danger. He knew Jonathan well enough to understand the threats weren't idle. They were strategy. And if Alexander didn't act soon, the twins' family would be pulled into a storm they couldn't possibly withstand. He closed the laptop, rubbed his face with his palms, and whispered to the empty room, "Not them. You're not touching them." His voice carried the kind of quiet resolve that came only when a man had nothing left to lose. That afternoon, somewhere far above the streets of Manhattan, Jonathan Kane looked out of his glass office window, watching the city stretch endlessly below. He believed he had Alexander cornered, humiliated, silenced. But far away in a shabby Texas motel, Alexander was preparing to fight back, not with the weight of money or power, but with something Jonathan couldn't understand. The fury of a man who had been humbled, and the fire of someone willing to risk everything to protect two little girls who had given him back his soul. And Jonathan, in all his arrogance, had no idea he had just lit the fuse of his own destruction. The motel room was quiet, except for the low hum of the ancient air conditioner rattling in the window. Alexander sat at the small wooden desk, his laptop casting a pale blue glow across his tired face. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. Jonathan thought humiliation would break him. He thought ridicule and shame would crush his spirit. But all Jonathan had done was back him into a corner, and a cornered man who has lost everything is the most dangerous kind of man. Alexander tapped a sequence of keys only he could remember. A hidden program flickered to life on the screen, not a program anyone at Technocore would recognize because he had written it himself years ago, long before Jonathan turned the company into a monster. It was a contingency he had never spoken of, not even to his closest advisors. Tonight, it would become his greatest weapon. The interface was simple, a plain black background, a blinking cursor, and a line of text, "Dead man switch armed." If he failed to enter a new code every 72 hours, the files he had collected, contracts, recordings, offshore bank transfers, hidden surveillance logs, would automatically flood the inboxes of investigative journalists across 7 countries. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing against him. He hadn't built this to protect himself. He had built it to protect the truth. But now it meant something more. It meant protecting Grace and Hope. It meant ensuring that Jonathan could never touch them without triggering a reckoning he couldn't escape. Alexander opened another folder. Names scrolled across the screen. Senators, CEOs, intelligence officers, foreign agents. Every one of them tied to Technocore's corruption. Every one of them terrified of exposure. He had enough evidence to collapse entire careers, to send shockwaves through Washington, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street. But what tightened his chest wasn't the power of the evidence. It was the memory of 2 little girls holding out their pink purse, offering $15.60 to a man the world believed had nothing. They hadn't cared about headlines. They hadn't cared about who he used to be. They had cared only that someone needed help. And that, Alexander realized, was more powerful than all the billions he had once controlled. His phone buzzed. Another message from Jonathan. "I hear those little friends of yours have school tomorrow. Be a shame if their mother lost her job and couldn't afford tuition. You should have stayed gone, Alex." Alexander stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. A spark lit in his chest, not just anger, but something sharper, purer, resolve. He opened yet another encrypted channel and began typing a message, not to journalists, not to lawyers, but to the people Jonathan didn't know existed. For 15 years, Alexander had mentored engineers, trained programmers, and inspired young idealists who believed in technology as a force for good. Many had left Technocore when Jonathan's greed turned it into a machine of surveillance and control, but they hadn't forgotten him. They owed him, respected him, trusted him, and now he needed them. The message was simple. It's time. Initiate Protocol Grace. Within minutes, responses began trickling in from around the world. One from Berlin, "We're ready." Another from Nairobi, "Say the word, Alex." From Sao Paulo, from Seoul, from a basement apartment in Boston, a network of ethical hackers, whistleblowers, and ex-employees came alive. Jonathan had an army of lawyers and spin doctors. Alexander had an invisible army of truth. He closed his laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the small town glowed faintly in the distance. Somewhere in that quiet sprawl, Grace and Hope were asleep, their pink purse resting by their bedside. They didn't know they had become the heart of a storm. They didn't know that two little voices at a gas station had awakened a man who had nearly given up. Alexander pressed his palm against the glass, his reflection staring back at him. "You made one mistake, Jonathan," he whispered to the night. "You threatened children, and when you do that, the rules change." For the first time in weeks, he felt a calm clarity wash over him. Not the calm of defeat, but the calm of a man who knows exactly what comes next. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was going to war. And this time it wasn't for his reputation, or even for revenge. It was for grace. It was for hope. And it was for the truth. The clock on the motel's nightstand glowed 2:13 a.m. when Alexander finally shut his laptop. His mind was still racing, but his body had grown heavy, worn down by days of running and weeks of humiliation. He poured himself a glass of lukewarm water from the bathroom tap, the taste of metal clinging to his tongue. Outside, the hum of 18-wheelers thundered along Route 65, carrying on with lives that had nothing to do with his collapse. He almost envied their simplicity. A knock came at the door, 2 quick raps, then silence. Alexander froze, his muscles tensing. No one should know where he was, not unless Jonathan's reach had extended this far. He stepped carefully across the room, picked up the iron poker he'd kept from the fireplace downstairs, and called out, "Who is it?" A calm, steady female voice answered, muffled through the door. "Samantha Torres, Washington Herald." Alexander's grip on the poker tightened, his chest constricting. The name cut through his suspicion. Torres wasn't just a journalist. She was a legend, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, known for ripping the veil off corruption at the highest levels. Governments feared her, corporations despised her, and unlike most reporters, she never chased cheap headlines. She chased truth. He lowered the poker, cracked the door open. Samantha stood there, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes. She wore a plain black jacket and jeans, a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked less like a celebrity journalist and more like someone who had spent her night in airports and bus stations to get here. Her eyes, though, sharp, alive, relentless, met his, and Alexander knew at once she was exactly who she claimed to be. "May I come in?" she asked, her tone neither pleading nor commanding. "Just steady." Alexander stepped aside. She slipped into the room, immediately surveying her surroundings with the practiced caution of someone who had walked into dangerous situations before. She dropped the backpack on the bed, unzipped it, and pulled out a small recorder and a stack of notepads. "I don't have much time. Neither do you. So let's get straight to it." Alexander studied her for a long moment, then pulled a black leather briefcase from under the desk. He placed it on the bed next to her things and snapped it open. Inside were documents, contracts, memos, financial transfers, photographs, even flash drives. The air in the room seemed to shift as Samantha leaned forward, her hands brushing the first stack of papers. "What you're holding," Alexander said, his voice low but steady, "is the reason Jonathan Kane wants me destroyed. Surveillance programs sold under the guise of national security, algorithms twisted to rig elections, blackmail operations against public officials, all tied back to Technocore, all tied back to him." Samantha flipped through the files, her lips tightening, her eyes widening at certain pages. "These are damning. This isn't just corporate greed, this is systemic abuse of power, mass surveillance on American citizens, data manipulation on a scale I've never seen." Alexander nodded grimly. "And Jonathan is ensuring no one believes me before this reaches daylight. He's turned me into a joke. The gas station photo, the memes, the narrative of a billionaire gone insane. It's all part of his strategy. And now he's threatening children to silence me." Samantha looked up sharply. "Children?" He told her about grace and hope, about the pink purse, about Jonathan's message. For the first time, Samantha's composed expression cracked. She pressed her lips together, anger flickering in her eyes. "He's not just ruthless, he's reckless. If this is true, he won't stop until he crushes you, or anyone who helped you." Alexander leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "That's why I need you. I can't fight this alone. If something happens to me, the files will leak automatically, but the world needs someone to give them context, to tie the threads together. Someone with credibility. That's you." Samantha was silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning the mountain of evidence before her. Then she reached into her backpack, pulled out a small external hard drive, and connected it to her laptop. "Let's copy everything. If what you're saying is real, we don't have days or weeks. We have hours before Kane escalates." Alexander exhaled, the first flicker of relief washing over him. He wasn't alone anymore. For weeks, he had been running in the dark, carrying a weight too heavy for one man. But now he had an ally, one who knew how to shine a light where the world least wanted it. As the files transferred, Samantha glanced at him. "You realize once we release this, there's no going back. You'll be hunted. I will too." Alexander met her gaze, his voice steady, unshaken. "They already hunt me. I've already lost everything. But I won't let him destroy those girls. Grace and hope showed me what matters. If I have to burn everything else to protect them, and the truth, I will." Samantha nodded slowly, her fingers tapping the table. "Then we go to war." The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence between them. Outside, the world still laughed at the fallen billionaire. But inside that dim motel room, a fire had been lit. The kind of fire that couldn't be contained by memes or stock prices, or even the power of a man like Jonathan Cain. Because when truth and innocence are threatened, the rules of the game change, and Jonathan was about to learn that the man he thought was broken was just getting started. The sun rose pale and hazy over the Texas countryside, but the warmth it promised never touched Alexander's chest. He sat at a diner booth across from Samantha, their coffee untouched, his eyes fixed on the small television mounted in the corner. A local news report ran on mute, replaying the same photograph that had spread like wildfire, the billionaire kneeling before two children with a pink purse. The caption beneath read, #Billionaire beggar, from CEO to gas station humiliation. Samantha tapped her pen against her notebook, her jaw tight. "It's getting uglier. Every outlet is running it. But..." She slid her laptop around so Alexander could see. "Look at this." On her screen were internal communications from Technocore. Samantha had intercepted them using one of Alexander's hidden backdoors. His old code, still alive in the company's veins, feeding him everything Jonathan didn't think he could see. The words on the email made Alexander's blood run cold. Target the Washington family, no physical harm, bureaucratic choke points, financial strain, controlled leaks, goal, destabilize their lives until Mitchell intervenes, document everything. Grace, Hope, Diane, their names weren't there, but he didn't need them to be. The Washington family, that was them. His hands curled into fists against the table. "He's going after them," Alexander muttered, his voice low, trembling not with fear but with fury. "He's going to make their lives unbearable until I show up, and then he'll spin it so I look like I'm using children to clean my image." Samantha leaned in, her voice urgent. "It's psychological warfare, Alex. He wants you trapped, damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you protect them, he paints you as a manipulator. If you stay silent, the girls pay the price." Alexander dragged a hand across his face. For years he had thrived on games of strategy, always fived. He moves ahead. But this wasn't business. This wasn't market share or government contracts. These were children. Grace with her bold little chin lifted in defiance. Hope with her steady eyes that had pierced straight into his soul. They weren't pawns. They were the reason he couldn't afford to lose. He glanced around the diner. Ordinary families sat in booths, children nibbling pancakes, parents scrolling phones. None of them knew that two little girls in their town were already being marked for destruction by men in glass towers hundreds of miles away. And the thought of it made Alexander's chest burn. Samantha reached across the table, her fingers brushing the edge of his clenched fist. "You're not powerless. You've got evidence, contacts, the dead man switch. You've got me. But you need to be careful. If you move too soon, you'll tip your hand. If you wait too long, Jonathan will crush them." The diner door opened with a chime, and Alexander's eyes instinctively flicked to it. A man in a cheap suit walked in, holding a clipboard. He didn't order food. He didn't even look hungry. Instead, he stopped at a booth near the window where a waitress was serving coffee. He flashed a badge, City Inspector. Alexander's stomach dropped. It was beginning. The inspection would spread. At Diane's workplace, at her home. School officials asking strange questions. Utility bills suddenly inflated. A dozen tiny cuts, each one designed to bleed her dry until she broke. Until the twins' kindness became their curse. Samantha saw the change in his expression and followed his gaze. Her lips thinned. "You're right. They've already started." Alexander pushed back from the booth, his chair scraping hard against the floor. His voice was steady, deadly calm. "I won't let him touch them, not one hair on their heads. If Jonathan wants to play dirty, then so will I, but I'll use the truth. And when the world sees what he's willing to do to children..." He exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing. "He'll be finished." Samantha closed her notebook, her own fire matching his. "Then let's get to work." For the first time since the gas station, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The shame, the humiliation, the laughter, none of it mattered anymore. Grace and Hope had offered him $15.60, but what they had really given him was purpose. Jonathan thought this was still a game of reputation, of power and money, but it wasn't, not anymore. This was about innocence, about two little girls who believed that helping even a little could make a difference. And Alexander was about to show Jonathan Kane and the entire world what happened when you threatened the only pure thing left in a broken man's world. The motel room had transformed into a war room. The desk was cluttered with coffee-stained notepads, Samantha's recorder, and Alexander's laptop, its screen glowing with lines of code that only he could read. The blinds were drawn tight, but every so often Alexander glanced at the window as if expecting Jonathan's shadow to fall across it. The thought of grace and hope in the crosshairs had stripped away every ounce of hesitation he once carried. He hunched forward, typing quickly, his fingers moving with a precision that belied the fatigue in his eyes. Samantha sat on the bed, scribbling notes, occasionally lifting her head to watch him with a mixture of curiosity and awe. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked finally. Alexander's voice was calm, deliberate. Technocore is built on surveillance. They believe they own everyone's information, emails, calls, financial trails. But what Jonathan doesn't know is that I designed the original system. I know every weak point, every blind spot. For the past week, I've been planting trackers in their own networks. Every email Jonathan sends, every meeting he holds, every dollar he moves, it's all being mirrored here. Samantha's pen stilled. "You're turning their surveillance on themselves." He nodded. "Exactly. He thinks he's tightening the noose around me, but every move he makes is already being logged, copied, archived. And when the time comes..." His eyes lifted hard and unflinching. "The world will see him for what he really is." The screen blinked, a new notification appearing. Alexander clicked it open. Surveillance footage filled the monitor, grainy but clear enough. It showed a man in a cheap suit standing at the front desk of a hospital. Diane's hospital, the twins' mother. He was flashing paperwork, smiling too politely. Alexander's jaw clenched. They've already begun pressuring her. Bureaucratic inspections, false complaints, classic intimidation tactics. He leaned back, dragging a hand over his face. "Jonathan's betting that I'll break before they do." Samantha closed her notebook and leaned forward. "Then flip it. Make every move he makes part of the story. Don't just collect evidence, turn it into a narrative people can't ignore. He's controlling headlines with memes and rumors. You hit back with proof." Alexander stared at her, and for the first time in days, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's exactly what I was thinking." He opened another channel on his laptop, typing quickly. Code scrolled down the screen, lines of green text racing like falling rain. Across the world, phones began buzzing, computers pinged, secure inboxes opened. His hidden network, the engineers he had mentored, the hackers who believed in transparency, the whistleblowers who owed him loyalty, were all receiving the same encrypted message. Protocol Grace had begun. Responses flowed back almost instantly. Berlin node online. Seoul ready. Boston standing by. Sao Paulo locked in. Each confirmation lit up his screen like stars on a map. A global constellation, of truth, aligned against Jonathan's empire. Samantha exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "You've built an army." Alexander corrected her, his voice low but steady. "Not an army, a shield, for grace and hope. For anyone Jonathan thinks he can trample." Another alert chimed. This time it wasn't an ally. It was from Jonathan himself. A copied email, fresh from Technocore servers. The subject line was chilling in its simplicity. Phase 2. Escalate. The body of the message made Samantha curse under her breath. Jonathan wasn't stopping at Diane's workplace. He wanted to push harder. School board complaints, sudden tax audits, even a fabricated CPS, Child Protective Services report. A tidal wave of harassment, each one perfectly legal on the surface, designed to bury Diane under pressure until she cracked. Alexander's hands trembled as he read, but his voice was like steel when he spoke. "He's using children as weapons. That ends now." He typed faster, sending commands, locking into databases Jonathan thought were untouchable. Emails, bank transfers, recorded phone calls, all copied and funneled to Alexander's servers. The deeper he dug, the more rot he uncovered. Bribes to senators, secret contracts with intelligence agencies, hidden accounts in offshore banks. Samantha watched, her eyes widening. "You're sitting on enough evidence to topple half of Washington." Alexander's eyes burned with a mixture of exhaustion and fire. And Jonathan Kane is arrogant enough to think he's untouchable. But the moment he threatened grace and hope, he signed his own death warrant. Outside, the neon motel sign flickered, humming faintly in the night. Inside, Alexander and Samantha were preparing a counterattack that would reach across continents. Jonathan had mocked him, humiliated him, tried to strip him of dignity. But Alexander had found something far stronger than dignity. He had found purpose. And with grace and hope as his compass, he was about to aim the truth like a blade straight in to the heart of Technocore's empire. The morning the world changed began without ceremony. Alexander sat in the motel room, his laptop open, Samantha pacing behind him like a coiled spring. The coffee in the styrofoam cups had gone cold hours ago, untouched. On the screen, the final progress bar crept toward completion, file after file, document after document being encrypted and prepared for release. At precisely 8 o'clock a.m., Alexander pressed a single key. The screen blinked, then the silence broke. Across the globe, inboxes belonging to 15 of the largest news organizations lit up with encrypted links. Reporters who had been asleep woke to their phones buzzing. Editors glanced at their screens and froze. Whistleblower files, verified metadata, unalterable timestamps. Everything Technocore had buried under a mountain of secrecy now lay bare. Within minutes, headlines began flashing. Explosive files leak from inside Technocore Industries. Mass surveillance on 200 million Americans exposed. Election manipulation, corporate giants tied to illegal algorithms. But the most devastating headline of all appeared on Samantha's own paper, The Washington Herald. Technocore CEO Jonathan Cain caught threatening children in leaked audio. Alexander leaned forward, staring at the text. His throat tightened. The audio clip was short, but it was enough. Jonathan's own voice, smooth and cruel, saying, "It would be a shame if something happened to her family because of you, don't you think?" The reaction was instant, volcanic. Parents across America, across the world, shared the clip with outrage. On social media, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Protect Grace and Hope. Hashtag Technocore Files. Hashtag Not Our Children. The memes that had once mocked Alexander shifted tone overnight. Now it was Jonathan Cain who was ridiculed, vilified, torn apart by the same internet machine he had weaponized. By new. Anchors on live television reported FBI agents entering Technocore headquarters with search warrants. Helicopter footage showed men in suits carrying boxes of files out of the 42nd floor offices. Employees streamed down to the street, faces pale, whispering to reporters about things they'd suspected but had been too afraid to say. In the boardroom, chaos reigned. Executives pounded the table, shouting, demanding answers from Jonathan. He stood at the head, his face drained of its usual smug composure. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Lawyers, politicians, allies calling not to offer help, but to sever ties. The very people who had once begged for his approval now treated him like a virus. "We can contain this," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. But even as he spoke, the stock ticker on the wall screen flashed red. Technocore down 20%, then 30%. Within hours, billions of dollars evaporated. By 3 p.m., trading had been halted altogether. Samantha sat cross-legged on the motel bed, her laptop balanced on her knees, scrolling through live coverage. "It's happening faster than I thought," she said. Her voice was a mix of awe and disbelief. "They're not just falling, they're imploding." Alexander didn't move. He stared at the small television mounted in the corner of the room, its grainy image showing Jonathan being escorted out of the Technocore building by federal agents. The mighty CEO reduced to a man clutching a cardboard box filled with personal items. His fall was public, humiliating, irreversible. And then came the interview that would etch itself into history. On the evening news, Grace and Hope sat side by side in their school uniforms, their mother Diane beside them holding their hands. The twins spoke softly, their voices trembling but clear. "Our grandma told us," Grace said, "that when someone needs help and you can help, even if it's a little, you help." Hope added, her words simple yet cutting through the noise like a blade. "Bad people forget how to be good. Maybe he'll remember now." Alexander felt his chest ache as he watched, his throat thick with emotion. The world wasn't just hearing the expose, they were seeing its heart. The innocence that Jonathan had tried to weaponize now shining brighter than any corruption he had hidden. Samantha turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "This isn't just your war anymore, Alex. This is theirs too. Those girls. They've become the face of something bigger than all of us." Alexander lowered his head, whispering their names under his breath. Grace. Hope. They had offered him $15.60. He had given them nothing in return but his promise. And now, because of them, an empire of corruption had fallen to its knees. That night, as protests erupted outside Technocore headquarters and global leaders scrambled to distance themselves from the company, Alexander sat in silence. The world saw him now not as a beggar at a gas station, but as the man who had dared to expose the truth. But he knew the credit didn't belong to him. It belonged to two children who had shown kindness in a moment when the world offered none. And because of them, Jonathan Cain's empire was crumbling into dust. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter filled the air outside a modest brick building in Austin, Texas. The building bore a new sign in simple letters, the Grace and Hope Foundation. It wasn't tall or glassy or built to intimidate like the towers of Manhattan. It was warm, inviting, alive. Its playground gleamed with new swings and bright slides, and its hallways were painted with murals of open skies and children holding hands. Inside, Alexander Mitchell sat in an office that was smaller than the guest bathrooms he used to walk past in his penthouse days. He wore no suit, no watch worth a fortune, no armor of power, just a plain shirt, rolled sleeves, and a face lined with fatigue. But softened with peace. On his desk sat a framed photograph of two little girls, Grace and Hope, holding their pink purse, their smiles as wide as sunlight. His assistant, Sarah Chun, a former Technocore employee who had left in disgust after the exposé, stepped into the room. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice half formal, half reverent, "we have 43 new corruption reports this week, and the documentary about the leaks. Netflix is pushing it to premiere next month." Alexander smiled faintly, running a hand across the photo. "Good. The more people who know the truth, the harder it will be for men like Jonathan to bury it again." Across the country, Jonathan Cain sat in a federal courtroom, his once perfectly tailored suits replaced by prison-issued gray. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. Emails, bank transfers, the audio of him threatening children. The jury had deliberated less than 2 hours. Guilty, 15 years. As the judge read his sentence, Jonathan's eyes dropped to the floor. For the first time in decades, his smile was gone. But for Alexander, justice wasn't in the courtroom. Justice was here, in the foundation that bore the names of the girls who had changed him. Justice was in the faces of children whose families were being protected by the whistleblowers his foundation supported. Justice was in the quiet certainty that truth had triumphed not because of power, but because of kindness. That afternoon, Alexander visited the school where Grace and Hope studied. The girls spotted him as soon as he stepped onto the playground. They sprinted across the yard, braids bouncing, pink purse still slung between them like a badge of honor. "Mr. Alexander!" Grace shouted, her voice brimming with excitement. Hope followed close, her eyes still steady, still piercing. They collided into his legs with a hug so fierce it nearly knocked him backward. Their mother Diane walked up slowly, shaking her head with a smile. "They've been asking every week when you come by again," she said. Alexander knelt down, looking at the twins at eye level. "I came to see if you two remembered something." "What?" Grace asked, curious. He pointed to the purse dangling between them. "That $15.60. Do you still have it?" Hope nodded proudly. "Of course, we're saving it for someone else who might need help." The breath caught in Alexander's throat. His eyes watered, but this time he didn't fight the tears. He let them fall, not from shame, but from gratitude. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "Never lose that. Because what you gave me that night, it changed everything. That $15.60 was worth more than $3 billion. The twins giggled, not fully understanding, but Diane's eyes glistened. She understood. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander stood outside the foundation, watching children of all colors run across the playground. Parents laughed, teachers waved, and for a moment, the world seemed lighter. A reporter approached him quietly, microphone in hand. "Mr. Mitchell, people call this one of the biggest corporate exposés in American history. But tell us, what do you believe started it all?" Alexander looked toward the playground. Grace and Hope were chasing each other across the grass, their laughter carrying like music. He smiled softly. "It started with two little girls at a gas station. They offered me $15.60 when I had nothing. They didn't see a billionaire. They didn't see a failure. They saw a man who needed help. That kindness reminded me of who I was and who I needed to be again." He paused, his voice dropping with conviction. "The greatest revolutions don't start in boardrooms. They start with grace, with hope, and sometimes with a pink purse full of coins." The reporter lowered her mic, speechless. As night settled over Austin, Alexander felt something he hadn't in years. Not power, not wealth, something far greater. Peace.